There comes a moment in every generation when a single glance at the world around you makes you realize something fundamental has broken, something so subtle and yet so widespread that it slips past most people until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You see it in strange flashes. A woman screaming into her phone that men are emotionally unavailable, while her entire profile is built on curated thirst traps designed to harvest attention. She has no intention of returning. Another woman posts a teary video about how she can't find loyalty, yet she proudly documents a lifestyle stitched together by situationships, hookups, and the celebration of choices that sabotage the very stability she claims to crave. And then there's the girl who preaches independence and empowerment. But every clip of her life revolves around demanding benefits, comfort, and provision from people she barely knows, as if support is a right, not something earned through reciprocity. These snapshots aren't just contradictions, they're symptoms of a deeper fracture, a slow drift away from reality into a world shaped by validation, fantasies, and the comforting illusion that consequences are optional. And somewhere between the curated lives people broadcast and the real outcomes they face, the truth becomes distorted enough that entire belief systems get built on air. This video is the map through that distortion, the reality beneath the highlight reels, the part no one wants to name out loud. And if any part of these images feels unsettlingly familiar, stay with me, because what comes next might explain far more than you expect. There is a kind of confidence that once required years of effort to build, the kind shaped by discipline, self-awareness, and the steady work of becoming someone others could rely on. Yet somewhere along the way, that slow and grounded process was replaced by something lighter, quicker, and infinitely more fragile. Modern culture has learned to mass-produce confidence, to inflate it like a balloon with air, borrowed from strangers online, leaving behind an outer shell that shines brightly while having almost nothing underneath to support it. You can see it in the way people talk about themselves now. Strength is assumed, not proven. Value is declared, not demonstrated. Identity is curated, not developed. And when someone receives a steady stream of likes, compliments, and shallow admiration, it becomes easy to believe that validation equals substance, that external approval is the same thing as internal worth, and that feeling confident should matter more than being competent. But this manufactured confidence carries a hidden fragility, because when confidence grows faster than character, any challenge becomes a threat. A boundary feels like rejection, critique feels like cruelty, normal expectations feel unfair. The person clings to the image they've crafted, terrified that any pressure will expose how much of it was built on air. And in the dating landscape, this imbalance plays out in predictable ways. Inflated expectations paired with underdeveloped relational skills, entitlement disguised as empowerment, and a belief that attention alone is proof of high value. Yet attention requires nothing. Real connection requires everything. And when someone believes they deserve more than they contribute, every relationship becomes strained under the weight of that illusion. Manufactured confidence feels powerful right up until the moment reality asks it to prove itself. If confidence today is mass-produced, then attention is the factory that never sleeps. The digital world has created a strange ecosystem where a single post, a single pose, a single curated moment can draw in more eyes than an entire lifetime once could. And with that flood of attention comes a deceptive sense of abundance. When hundreds of people glance, react, or message, it becomes almost impossible not to feel chosen, wanted, or desired. But attention in this era no longer behaves like genuine interest. It behaves like noise, scattered and impulsive, disappearing as fast as it arrives. This is where the illusion begins, because when someone is surrounded by constant digital engagement, they start to believe the number of options they have is limitless, that every ping or DM is a potential partner, and that the dating world is overflowing with possibilities. Yet the reality is far more hollow. Most of those expressions of interest are copy and paste impulses. Not investment. Curiosity. Not commitment. Fantasy. Not intention. The quantity feels overwhelming, but the quality hovers near zero. And when attention becomes abundant, value becomes distorted, standards rise, expectations inflate, and the actual effort needed to sustain a relationship begins to feel unnecessary because the illusion suggests that something better is always one swipe away. The person becomes conditioned to chase novelty instead of connection, validation instead of partnership. But attention is a misleading mirror. It reflects who reacts, not who stays. And the more someone relies on the volume of eyes watching, the less able they become to recognize the rare ones who truly see them. In a world flooded with attention, genuine options shrink, even as the illusion expands. One of the most subtle shifts in modern culture is the way validation has replaced value, not as an occasional mistake, but as a dominant operating system. There was a time when worth was built slowly, shaped by character, reliability, emotional maturity, and the ability to show up for others, qualities that required effort, introspection, and growth. But now, worth is often measured by something far easier to acquire: the reactions of strangers who know nothing about the person they're affirming. Validation feels like value because it delivers the emotional hit without demanding any substance to justify it. A well-lit photo, a curated caption, a moment crafted for attention. Each one gathers a wave of affirmation that tells someone they are exceptional, desirable, sought after. And when this external approval arrives again and again, without resistance or context, it becomes easy to mistake applause for achievement, flattery for depth, and visibility for importance. But validation has a flaw that real value does not. It evaporates the moment attention shifts elsewhere. It offers comfort, but never stability, confidence, but never grounding. And when a person builds their identity on the reactions of others, they become trapped in a cycle where the next hit of validation feels essential, even though each hit leaves them emptier than before. This is why accountability feels offensive now, why criticism feels like attack, and why emotional demands rise even as emotional contribution declines. When self-worth is inflated through external praise, any challenge threatens the entire structure. Validation promises wholeness, but it delivers dependency, and dependency disguised as confidence is the first crack in every modern relationship. There is a particular kind of comfort that grows when someone learns to see themselves as the one who is always harmed, always misunderstood, always wronged. Victimhood, once a temporary state meant to be healed and moved through, has become a long-term identity that rewards people for staying wounded instead of rising. And in a culture where sympathy is abundant and accountability is scarce, this identity is easier to keep than to confront. Victimhood offers a simple narrative. If I am hurting, it must be someone else's fault. It removes the burden of reflection, silences the need for growth, and transforms every misstep into an injustice. It feels soft, protective, validating, and because the world responds to vulnerability with comfort, the person learns to lean on that response instead of strengthening the parts of themselves that could prevent the same pain from happening again. But like every illusion, this comfort takes something in return. It takes the ability to recognize patterns. It takes the willingness to accept responsibility. It takes the maturity required to build healthy relationships. A person who clings to victimhood becomes untouchable, not in the sense of being strong, but in the sense of refusing to let truth reach them. Over time, every failed relationship becomes evidence of persecution. Every boundary feels like rejection. Every expectation feels like cruelty. And because the story always absolves them, they never see the role they play in the outcomes they keep repeating. The tragedy is that victimhood feels safe, but it quietly locks the door from the inside. And when someone lives behind that door long enough, they mistake the cage for protection and the loneliness for something the world has done to them rather than something they continue to do to themselves. Empowerment, in its original form, was never meant to be effortless. It was something earned, a quality developed through discipline, resilience, and the courage to confront the parts of yourself that kept you from growing. But somewhere between motivational slogans and the endless demand for positive messaging, empowerment detached itself from effort and drifted into a version that requires nothing but belief. And when belief becomes louder than behavior, empowerment turns into performance rather than substance. In the modern landscape, empowerment often means declaring strength without demonstrating it, rejecting expectations without offering alternatives, demanding benefits without acknowledging responsibilities. It encourages people to claim the identity of a powerful adult while quietly evading the work that adulthood requires. And because this version of empowerment feels affirming and effortless, it becomes far more attractive than the older, heavier version rooted in accountability. The paradox is that empowerment without effort doesn't make someone stronger, it makes them brittle. Anything that challenges their self-image feels oppressive. Anything that asks for growth feels like an attack. The person begins to believe that wanting something is the same as deserving it, that asserting a need should automatically secure fulfillment, and that discomfort itself is proof that someone else is doing something wrong. But in relationships, this illusion collapses quickly. Real partnership requires reciprocity, sacrifice, patience, and decoupable maturity, qualities that no amount of slogans can replace. And when someone expects the rewards of connection without contributing the work, the relationship bends under the weight of imbalance. Empowerment that demands nothing ultimately gives nothing except a louder voice, masking a weaker foundation. Every marketplace in human history shifts when perception grows faster than reality, and the dating market is no different. For years, technology has inflated the sense of personal demand far beyond what real-world compatibility can sustain, creating a widening gap between what people believe they can attract and what they are prepared to maintain. Attention has become so abundant, so instantaneous, and so detached from actual commitment that many have mistaken fleeting interest for genuine desirability. And once that belief sets in, expectations rise much faster than value. It begins quietly. A person posts a curated moment and receives a wave of reactions. They interpret this as evidence of high market demand, even though most of those reactions require no investment, no intention, and no follow-through. Before long, they begin comparing every real interaction to the inflated ecosystem of digital attention, seeing ordinary partners as underwhelming, consistent affection as unexciting, and the slow build of genuine connection as inferior to the dopamine hit generated by strangers they will never meet. Meanwhile, the top tier of men, those who are charismatic, highly social, or visually appealing, receive a disproportionate share of attention, reinforcing the illusion for women that this narrow group represents the average. And when most women direct their efforts toward the same small percentage of men, the middle of the market collapses, leaving solid, stable partners invisible, while unrealistic expectations grow stronger. This inflation doesn't just distort selection, it distorts self-assessment. Standards climb without corresponding growth, desires expand without matching contribution, and disappointment becomes the default outcome because the market someone imagines no longer resembles the market they actually participate in. And like every bubble built on perception rather than substance, the correction always arrives slowly at first, then all at once. Double standards have existed in every era, but the modern version has taken on a complexity that makes it harder to recognize and even harder to challenge. They don't show up as loud, obvious contradictions. They emerge through quiet expectations, shifting rules, and selective interpretations of fairness that overwhelmingly tilt in one direction. And what makes the spiral so difficult to break is that many of these standards are framed not as imbalances, but as empowerment, which means questioning them feels like violating a cultural script rather than seeking actual equality. You can see it clearly in preferences. When women set strict filters for height, income, lifestyle, or ambition, it is framed as discernment or having standards. But when men articulate their own preferences, whether for youth, health, or emotional stability, the same culture often labels it shallow or problematic. One side's criteria are celebrated, the others are scrutinized. The same distortion appears in responsibility. Men are expected to provide, protect, initiate, and maintain stability, often without acknowledgement, while women are encouraged to choose themselves, even if that means opting out of effort. When a man asks for reciprocity, it becomes negotiation. When a woman demands it, it becomes empowerment. These double standards don't remain isolated. They accumulate. They create resentment on one side, entitlement on the other, and confusion between them. Over time, the relational field becomes uneven. One person is expected to audition while the other evaluates. One invests while the other decides. One adapts while the other insists. And in a landscape where expectations grow heavier for one side and lighter for the other, connection slowly loses its balance because no relationship can thrive when fairness is treated as optional. One of the most overlooked forces shaping modern relationships is the way many people have grown accustomed to emotional turbulence, so accustomed that chaos begins to feel familiar while stability feels strangely uncomfortable. When someone spends years in environments where affection comes with unpredictability, where intimacy is tangled with conflict, or where validation is tied to drama, the nervous system learns to equate intensity with connection. And once that wiring takes hold, peace can feel less like safety and more like emptiness. This is why so many individuals describe healthy partners as boring, even when those partners are steady, respectful, and emotionally available. Calmness lacks the adrenaline spikes they've grown used to. Consistency doesn't trigger the highs and lows that once made their experiences feel meaningful. Instead of seeing stability as a foundation, they interpret it as a lack of passion, not realizing that what they call passion is often just the activation of unresolved emotional patterns. The tragedy is that when someone is conditioned to mistake chaos for chemistry, they become drawn to the very relationships that hurt them. They chase partners who ignite old wounds, repeat cycles they claim to hate, and walk away from those who could actually offer peace. And because the emotional pull of chaos feels stronger than the unfamiliar comfort of stability, they assume the chaos must be more real, more intense, more right. But peace is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of safety. It is the space where trust can grow, where affection can deepen, and where love can mature without constantly being interrupted by volatility. The fear of peace doesn't mean peace is wrong. It means chaos has been home for far too long. There is a quiet tension that sits beneath the surface of modern dating, a tension created not by cruelty or judgment, but by the simple fact that time shapes desirability in ways our culture no longer wants to acknowledge. For most of human history, people understood that different stages of life carried different forms of value. Youth brought visibility, energy, and potential, while age brought stability, wisdom, and depth. But today, the beauty economy has blurred these distinctions by offering tools that preserve the appearance of youth long after the realities of it have passed. The problem isn't aging. Aging is natural, universal, and inevitable. The problem is the denial of it, the refusal to accept that attraction follows patterns older than any social movement. When someone spends years immersed in an environment where attention is abundant, it becomes almost unthinkable that this attention could ever shift, even though every generation before has experienced that shift without surprise. And when that moment finally arrives, it feels like betrayal rather than biology. Technology intensifies the gap. Filters smooth the skin. Angles reshape the body. Algorithms amplify the most youthful faces. And slowly, the digital world creates a version of someone that no longer aligns with the reality others encounter in person. The larger that gap becomes, the sharper the disappointment feels, not because the person has lost value, but because the illusion created expectations that real life could never sustain. The truth is that beauty changes, but connection doesn't have to. Time takes nothing away from someone who builds qualities that endure. The problem arises only when someone clings to a digital reflection and expects the world to respond as if the mirror never changed. Denial doesn't preserve beauty, it only postpones acceptance. Every illusion eventually reaches a point where it can no longer float above the weight of reality. And the modern dating landscape is fast approaching that moment, not because people are bad, and not because relationships are doomed, but because the gap between perception and contribution has stretched so far that the system can no longer hold itself together. When expectations rise endlessly while effort remains stagnant, a correction becomes unavoidable. The same way any overheated market eventually cools, recalibrates, and returns to equilibrium. You can feel the early signs already. Men stepping back not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. Women sensing that attention no longer arrives with the same intensity it once did. Conversations becoming shorter, patience thinning, commitment becoming rarer because fewer people are willing to invest in a landscape where roles are unclear. Reciprocity is inconsistent, and validation competes with genuine connection at every turn. These shifts don't announce themselves loudly. They happen subtly, quietly, almost invisibly in missed chances, fading interest, and relationships that never quite take shape. What's unfolding is not a collapse, but a recalibration. When someone has relied too heavily on attention, reality teaches them the difference between impulse and intention. When someone has built their confidence on validation, life inevitably tests whether that confidence has roots or merely decoration. When someone expects exceptional treatment without offering exceptional qualities, the market responds with indifference, not malice. And this correction, slow, steady, and deeply personal, becomes the moment of truth for many. It is when illusions fall away, when outcomes reflect effort instead of fantasy, and when the world, finally, stops rewarding the image someone tried to project and begins responding to the person they actually are. Reality always reclaims what illusion borrows, and it never asks permission before it does. In the end, every illusion meets the moment where it can no longer stand on borrowed confidence, borrowed attention, or borrowed stories. Reality always comes back quietly, steadily, without anger, and when it does, it shows us the distance between who we imagined ourselves to be and who we've actually become. That moment isn't meant to break us, it's meant to bring us home. Because love has never belonged to the loudest performance. It grows in the quieter places where accountability replaces excuses, where effort replaces entitlement, and where two people choose truth over the comfort of their own narratives. When validation fades and the noise settles, what remains is the person you are when no one is applauding. And that version of you is the only one capable of sustaining something real. If there is a path forward, it begins here, choosing growth over ego, choosing clarity over illusion, choosing the kind of honesty that demands yours instead of retreat. The correction the world is moving toward isn't a threat. It's a chance to build a foundation that won't collapse the moment the spotlight shifts. So before you go, tell me what moment opened your eyes. When did the illusion first crack? And what truth did it reveal about where you're headed next?